So thank you all for joining us tonight. We're really fortunate this evening to hear from three exceptional panelists, each of whom has his own particular and deeply informed perspective on Richard Carlyon's work. And I think before we get underway, Eleanor, did you want to say a few words of welcome?
I really wanted to say a few words of thanks. Thanks Alice and Julia for this opportunity and for especially letting us have the whole first floor, which allowed us to show work that had not been seen in a long time. Some of these very large paintings have not been out since the 1970s. I'd like especially to thank Ashley Kistler, who curated the show. She spent literally countless hours at Plant Zero going through racks of paintings and many stacks of boxes of drawings to come up with this wonderful selection of pieces. Especially important was the conservation work that Scott Nolly did. 4 of the paintings that he conserved we were able to show after many years of being in the racks. I'd like to thank Angeline Roberts, who designed the catalog, very beautiful catalog, and Terry Brown, who did the photographs. The contributors in the catalog, Paul Ryan's beautiful essay and Chris Burnside's touching Dick Carlyon story, and Ashley's essay, of course. I'd like to thank Howard Rosati for agreeing to be on the panel tonight. Howard wrote the distinguished essay on Richard's life and work in 2009 for the retrospective. Everyone that worked on this project did so with such respect and admiration for Dick's work and for his place in the history of this art community. And I think that's why it has turned out so beautifully. So thank you all. Thanks.
Thanks, Eleanor. My assignment for my fellow panelists has been to offer a little structure while leaving a lot of breathing room for their comments. Thank you, Scott. And so I've got a couple of questions, and we'll certainly look to you for additional questions for the last 15 minutes or so of this program. So I thought we would have you all do you all have a copy of the catalog? And have you had a chance to read Paul's essay, which is just really a beautiful, beautiful essay? But I thought we would, sort of taking a cue from you, first explore the cultural milieu in which Carlyon's artistic sensibilities took shape. What influenced and inspired him? And of course, Paul, you make this connection specifically with regard to film, while also sort of mentioning a lot of the sort of pivotal elements that made up that culture. So maybe if you would offer some introductory remarks with regard to that topic, and then Howard, can we hear your thoughts, including how this very vibrant time of experimentation, I guess we're talking the 1960s, was manifest locally when Carlyon had just recently joined the faculty of RIP, which of course was to become VCU. So sort of looking at it in a general sense and then more specifically.
Okay, all right. Yeah, I think that what was happening in the art world in the late 1950s and through the 1960s was such a dynamic series of events, I might say. Of course, we come from late 50s into the 60s, sort of with abstract expressionism leading the way, and then we hit pop, and Caporal comes onto the stage in the 1960s with his emphasis on the everyday, the importance of the everyday. And then, of course, we hit minimalism and conceptualism And so there's this really strong dynamic that's occurring during this time, again, the late 1950s and through the 60s. And this is a time when Richard was really starting to come into his own, to really, he was really starting to find his own identity, I think. And my feeling and my perception is that this time, this era that he sort of came through and that had a big effect on him, what happens then stays with Richard, and it unfolds throughout his entire career. The way that I see Richard's career as a painter and a video artist and a drawer and etc. It's not a matter of going from one idea and then adding on another idea, adding on another idea. They're all coming from this core that he felt and experienced in the late 1950s and the 60s. So that idea of his career unfolding, to me, seems to be something that's really important.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And he's in New York in the early middle 50s, but then he comes back to Richmond, and I know he gets involved in all kinds of avant-garde things. The Bang festivals here, where people like Cage were brought in. I think Robert Morris was here, Yvonne Rainer. There's a story that I think Bernard Martin told me, where there was a performance as part of the festival where Robert Morris and Yvonne Rainer, I think, are nude, and they walk across the stage like this, right? This is Richmond, Virginia in the 60s, right? And he said, Bernard said, yeah, then we were called into the president's office, and I knew we were going to get fired. And while we're getting heat from the president, in comes Teresa Pollock and says, you should have seen it, it was a great performance, and blah, blah, blah. And he says, she saved our jobs. But there was interesting stuff happening, and Cage was here. And I think that the notion of the idea of chance that Cage was involved in, sort of letting things happen, became part of what Richard was very much interested in. And I think we see that, especially with the works in the other part of the gallery, so that chance, and you encounter stuff, and then you take advantage of the things you find, and you refine them, and you go back, and as you were suggesting, see things that you did before, and you do something else to them. And I think that's been part of what Richard has done.
Yeah. Thank you. That's we'll come back to the drawings too in a little bit and discuss those procedures and the tools he used to make them maybe a little bit later. I had a chance to see Anne Truitt's gorgeous show at the National Gallery yesterday, and it brought back something I had read in the New York Times a couple of months ago. It's just a short notice when that exhibition first opened, and I think these remarks are very apt in the context of this conversation. Will Hendrick wrote, and I quote, "Truitt's otherworldly but deeply humane wooden monoliths are unmistakable demonstrations of the positive value of restraint. You can't see every one of the 20 or so layers of paint that went into a piece like the nearly 7-foot-tall golden yellow Summer Remembered," referring to one of her sculptures, "but it shimmers distinctly with the artist's focused concentration." So this sort of gets us into a conversation about Carlyon's process and craft. And Scott, I'd like to hear from you now. And as Eleanor mentioned, Scott conserved 4 of the paintings in this show, and is really privy at this point to the inner workings of those paintings. So could you sort of walk us through that?
I'm in a unique position to sort of follow the trail of breadcrumbs that get left behind, and that's always, it's a bit of church and a bit of appreciation and reverence. It's an amazing position to be in. I was thinking on the way over here how to sum him up. He spun gold from straw, and I think that begs a little bit of an explanation. He's one of the early adopters of acrylic emulsion paints. And the history of acrylic paints begins in the early 1900s. The Germans are making solvent-based pigment systems out of them. Leonard Beaucourt and Sam Golden of Golden Acrylic Artist Colors fame begin working with acrylic paints in this country in the 50s, and they come up with the tube paints called Beaucourt, which were mineral spirit solvent paints, which I wish they were still around because they were a great retouching and in-painting material and conservation. They aged well, they were reversible. It was in the 60s that the first line of Liquitex products came out. And they were not that great. They were not that interesting. And there are a lot of reasons for this. You can't get a lot of pigment into an acrylic emulsion binder, a water-soluble acrylic material. There are certain pigments that can't be turned into acrylic paints because of their various physical and pH characteristics. So it was a limited palette, this first palette of paints that came out with Liquitex, and they were not adopted wholeheartedly by artists. In fact, there was about a decade of time there where artists sort of thought of them as second-class citizens as far as paints went. And the industry struggled to improve them in formulation to bring them up to par with the working characteristics of oil paints, the optic properties of oil paints. So it is the two paintings that are in the other room, Slate and
The
Trapeze,
Trapeze,
those are done in Liquitex paints. And you can actually see in his work this complex composition of laminate application of paints, that he strives for this level of optic property that comes out of more traditional paint mediums from the past. These paintings here are done with golden emulsion paints, and they're much more interesting just by virtue of the material he was using. But by that time, he had come about a language of layering these materials in complex relationships of pigment and binder to intense optical effect. They're really quite amazing feats of color engineering. One example would be sort of adopting the Van Eyck and Northern European painting technique for oil, where you lay down a somewhat dull, impassable color and improve upon it by applying transparent layers of brighter colors or dye-based colors in a similar binder, creating an optic environment where the light from the room goes into the painting and hits that undercoat and comes back through these transparent layers. So you have the experience twice. And it gives an optic depth and complexity to the paintings. It's really outstanding. And it was like developing photographs, because just a few years of accumulated dust and grime on some of these paintings was enough to obscure that tissue-thin, delicate complexity, which is really outstanding. And so that's my experience with this work, up close and personal.
And is there anything else to add, Scott, on the horizontal, very dark gray painting with a metallic silver band, which is in the other gallery, which was one of Dick's last paintings? And in fact, he had damaged it in the studio, and it's never been on view before. But Scott was able to repair the surface of that.
It's classic color field painting, very sort of Rothko, unwieldy. Once the damage is physical and optic, it's very hard to work and repair and reintegrate small damages into a continuous field of color. But his choice of materials and the fact that the paint films were so sturdy and so durable in construction made them actually easier to treat than some of the more difficult color field works that I've worked on before. Mm. And they snapped too. They became completely different paintings.
An amazing transformation.
It really is quite something.
So it seems to me, and Howard, you're probably familiar with that very long statement, artist statement that Dick made in 1975. It goes on for 2 full pages. And he's talking about his intent and the end result he hopes to achieve through this very complicated process and highly crafted process in terms of providing a particular kind of visual engagement for the viewer. And you've spoken very eloquently about this before. Can you?
Yeah, I've been thinking about the works for a long time, and you asked me about, Richard in the 60s, but he was in New York in the 50s, and he did paintings there, but this was still the New York school. I mean, Pollock was alive, Rothko, Newman, Klein, all these people. And one of the things, and Eleanor and I have talked a little bit about this, that has struck me is that Europeans said Americans make big paintings, that's because they have big studios, right? But that really misses the point. I mean, that they made big paintings, but the paintings were not supposed to be seen from across the room, but up front and close. And this happens in Richard's paintings. I remember in the National Gallery, saw the Ann Truitt show, but also saw Tony Smith's Die, which is a 6-foot cube, and it reminds me of the Leonardo Universal Man, where he stands with his arms out in a square, then he has his arms up and his legs out in a circle in the square. And somebody said, well, why didn't you make this bigger? And he said, I didn't want to make a monument. Well, why didn't you make it smaller? He says, I didn't want to make an object. I wanted to make a sculpture. And this idea of its relationship to the body, I think, is prevalent in Richard's paintings as well. And the body in relation to the object, the size is connected to that. The way it's hung on the wall also is in relation to the body. And this really does come out of, I think, Abbeck's painting from the 50s and the 60s. So while we have pop art and all that stuff, we see this other element going through. And I would also say about these paintings that, unlike pop art, they demand a kind of attention and a kind of focus. And you're talking about the way the materials were done, but you're supposed to look and see and contemplate these things in a very different way. And like Slate back there, or even the Passage to India, if you look at it carefully, you see some stripes that were there and aren't there now, and they're like traces or shadows or memories. And if Dick didn't want them, they would be there, because he would have gotten them out of there. So they're there, but you have to look very carefully to see what's going on there. And I think that's part of this close thoughtfulness, this really paying attention that the work offers. And it doesn't reveal itself unless you do this, I would say.
And sort of part of that, apropos of your comments, Howard, we tried in installing this show to respect Dick's preference that the paintings be hung lower than they probably normally would, you know, with the work of another artist. So, and Paul, you know, Paul is, as you all know, an amazing painter himself, who's developed his own singular, meticulously crafted painting process. So I'm curious as to what comments you would add to Howard's.
Yeah, I'm glad we're talking about the craftsmanship within the art here. I think that is part of, as you just said, Howard, part of his practice of paying attention. And that's, of course, a concept that he takes from Cage, from John Cage, and who was, as you all know, was very influential to Richard. But this idea of paying attention, certainly it has to do within the making of each work of art, whether it's a painting or a collage or a video or whatever. But of course, it also has to do with what he was seeing in the world from day to day, what he was paying attention to. And one thing that's occurred to me, if I might get into politics here some, is that it occurs to me that there is a sort of a politics of paying attention. When I came in to see the show for the first time this afternoon, it's at the opposite end of what's happening in our society, in our country right now. And I'm talking about the grotesque, narcissism, and sociopathy, actually, that's happening within our country right now through the government. I don't think I need to get too specific. I think you know what I'm talking about here. And Richard's show, including his craftsmanship as well as what he was seeing through this practice of paying attention, seems to be an antidote to the crudity and the selfishness and the self-interest that seems to want to try to be dominant within our society and our culture right now. So I was interested in that, how these, which of course are very aesthetically oriented, but how they, for me, when I came in and saw them, they really took on a kind of a political quality to them through their dignity and their quietness and the craftsmanship, the caring and the paying attention, you know. So
I would like to add on. I absolutely agree with what Paul's saying. And you know, when I walked the campus, for a while there, I was thinking I was running into all these crazy people because they're talking to themselves. Well, I realized they're on their cell phone. They got these things in their ears. They're not looking at stuff. They don't pay attention to the environment. I mean, like this wonderful fall weather and the light coming through the trees. they're totally oblivious to that. So they're not paying attention and they're not engaged in the real world. And I mean, I would maybe, there's a political aspect to that as well, right? So the aggressive thing, the stupid statements, nothing subtle, no complexity to the thought, and this is the kind of world we live in, and Richard's work is just the opposite, right? You don't get this unless you pay attention, otherwise there's nothing there for you. And so he asks you to pay attention, which is the last thing people want to do. Everything, there's a kind of constant entertainment, so you're not connected to your thoughts, and so you always got something on, or this, or texting while you're driving. I mean, you can't even pay attention to driving. It's a strange phenomenon we live in today, I think.
I thought it was very interesting, Eleanor, when you brought up the point that at one point someone had commented to Dick that he probably used a roller to apply these paints to the surfaces. That he was horrified by that. You talk about a gross gesture. He mastered the material. I mean, it may look uniform and incredibly jewel-like and regular, but these are brush-applied paints. And he knew how to modify his medium to get just that effect, that delicate effect. And it rewards. I think the geometric forms invite you, but once you consider, they start to reveal themselves in very complicated ways. They were really beautiful.
Of course, the evidence of that process can be seen in the video Red Again, which is on view there. Yeah. Scott, you also mentioned, this is an interesting observation, in terms of the video, the music that's playing on in the background. And you had made this connection between the music, which is Cajun or
Philip
Glass, this sort of minimalist music. You made the connection between that and what Dick was doing on the canvas. Can you talk a little bit about that?
In an earlier career, I was a music student, and I was always thrilled with composition. And it just struck me that this technical aplomb with layers of turbid acrylic colors and creating optic depth was very much akin to that sort of compositional style, where form is repeated with very delicate and slight harmonic or orchestral color shifts that make for an incredibly lush kind of landscape, and that happens in these works. I think we were looking at a couple of them in his studio with the ultraviolet lamp, and there were little bits of residue where the taping of the rectangles had been. And when one would think, for instance, intuitively it would be best to sort of tape off a square and then paint the background, he had done the reverse. He had evolved the forms in the pictures in negative space, building around them rather than building the forms out of the backgrounds. So there's a lot of very specific compositional choices that have small, subtle impacts, but read all through the work, and I think they're incredibly palpable.
Well, Richard once said to me, I thought it was a profound remark, is it isn't it interesting at a rock concert, everybody listens together and all the clap. At a classical music concert, everybody listens individually. And I can see that in his work. You look individually, right? It's not a team effort, right? Yeah.
Well, it's interesting to think about the terms maximal and minimal in relationship to Richard's work and how that sort of threads through. Do you have any further comments about that aspect of his work, Howard, or Scott, or Paul? And maybe this can also take us into the drawings and works on paper.
I think it's elegance. I think that's the definition of elegance, when you get maximum return for minimum gesture. I mean, there's a wisdom and intelligence in that result that is remarkable.
Yeah, I think he strips them down to make a certain effect. And you mentioned Anne Truitt, and I think of Richard and Anne Truitt together. Yeah, there's a very subtle kind of aspect that goes on in the layering of color and how you use color. I'm not sure that it would be, like say Robert Morris or that kind of minimalism where you're just seeing the object. I mean, color works here, and the object, the painting becomes something because of the way the color and forms are put together. But generally, minimalism you don't see that much of, I would say. Yeah.
I think for me, it's this concept ties in to how can I put it here? I guess the importance of small things, okay? Back to this idea of paying attention, but the importance of the significance of very small things, I think, was something that was really big for Richard. So, I mean, for example, the red painting here, which just, I was blown away by when I came in this afternoon. You know, there's a way we can talk about this painting as being a very simple composition containing some small things, even though the painting itself is quite a large painting. But to stand in front of this painting and give it your attention for even just 10 seconds, and of course you want to spend more than that, but just giving it attention for 10 seconds, the painting is just giving and giving and giving. And it wants to go beyond itself, again, even though it's a fairly good-sized painting. And that's true with many or most of the paintings, I would say. They do want to go beyond the things that they are here.
That's well put. Yeah.
So Paul, you mentioned the things that Carlyon paid attention to and the sort of political intent in that, and Howard, you understood that in contrast to what we generally witness today. And I want to turn to his drawings now because they do give you a little more of a specific indication of what he was paying attention to. And in going through the work, you know, for me, Dick continued to paint through the 1980s, but that was also a decade where he was making hundreds and hundreds of collages. And also, I guess, beginning towards the end of the 1980s, making his Xerox books. And, you know, there is still just such a wealth of material that has not been seen, and perhaps there will be an opportunity to fill one giant room with all these collages and drawings at some point. But it was in the mid-1990s when Richard returned to making drawings. And I think it's interesting to sort of delve into why he made that transition. And of course, there are many, many drawings from, I would say, what, the last 10 years, the last 8 years. And once he jumped back into drawing, he just, you know, he just produced an amazing amount of work. So Howard, could you talk a little bit about that transition?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure why the transition came about, but I do see a sort of Cajun influence where the notion of chance, where you just find things and then you start to see relationships to them. I mean, there are the collages, there's a couple of early ones, and you see these handprints on them, and I sort of think of Native American handprints. I'm here, I exist or something, you get these things on a wall. But you also see this funny relationship between stuff in the picture. There's a guy holding his foot with his hand. There's a handprint there, but it's pointing to this woman's shoes and her feet, like I'm going to grab these or something. Or there's some people running and somebody's just touching the back of this woman. Right? So it's that kind of thing that he finds, it seems to me, and it just comes about by chance. And then he sort of works these things through. Very much like what Cage would do, seems to me. But the later ones then become sparser in some ways, and this may also be a kind of Cajun influence, but one thing, when Cage went to Europe, this was in the 50s, he discovered this composer named Anton Webern. Webern was a student of Schoenberg, and he learned how to write atonal music. Take the 12 pitches and you put them in an order, and you always keep them in that order throughout the piece. But when you look at Webern's things, they tend to be very short. Some pieces are only 2 or 3 minutes long. But when you start here and you go through, by the time you get to the middle, you're going backwards again. So when you get to the end, you're at the beginning. It's like the last year in Marienbad. So there's no beginning and end, and it's the weirdest kind of stuff. And even within the pieces, you go up, say, a minor third, come down a major third, and then you do just the opposite. So again, you end up where you started. And I think that influenced Cage, and I see a lot of that in sort of Richard's things too. Empty spaces, silence. That's another thing that comes out of Weber. And when Cage did the 4 minutes and 33 seconds, where the guy came to the stage, David Tudor, he sat at the piano for 4 minutes and 33 seconds and didn't play anything. It was the ambient sound that was the music. And you see some of that, I think, in Richard. There's a similarity there, an understanding of that approach, I would say. You find stuff, and something happens. It's almost like the ambient sounds around the artist that end up in some of the collages of drawing, I think.
Did you want to add anything to that, Paul?
Yeah, I think building on what Howard has just said, it seems to me that the movement into the drawings and Richard spending more time drawing was a desire to be more playful too. There's sort of a fun quality that I sense, and a lot of it ties into exactly what you were saying, that comes from chance and chance operations and uncertainties and being surprised in the making process, that I think he became very interested in. Not that there wasn't a playful quality in some of these kinds of paintings that we see. I think that you could argue that there is, in fact, which we see in the film, where he's making one of these paintings. But I think myself as a painter, I just sort of, when he made that change, I just sort of felt, yeah, it makes sense. He wants to put these behind him, at least temporarily, and go into these smaller scale pieces where he could have more fun, in a way, I think. That's sort of simply, I guess, how I see it.
I mean, I've looked at those a bit, and I know that he used chance to find things. And he also did stuff on the Xerox machine or copy machine. And then I'm not exactly sure how he dropped pieces out, but he would have, and so you'd be reading a sentence and certain words would get dropped out, or they would shift it over so that it became hard to read, and it made other implications.
Like you see in the collages, too.
In the collages, yeah, and those late drawings as well. I think you see those things. He is interested in hand, and there is this sign language element that comes in as well. So you see these things, but unless you know sign language, you don't quite know what's going on. And I suspect the sign language isn't telling us a lot either. The sign language forms in there. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But I know he developed a system for using chance then in a very, well, I guess it's a structured way to then do these small things, then to reproduce them at a larger scale on the mylar that we see back there.
And also you've talked and you've written so eloquently about chance and what a rigorous process that is.
Yeah, for Cage, it was a matter of, first of all, he came out of the I Ching, which is this Chinese book of changes, and you come with a number and then you read the thing. But you throw dice or something through dice and you come out with all these numbers. And he said it took so much time, even doing this on the subway. Finally had a computer print out of arbitrary random numbers, which then he used and crossed them off and determined that. And so, I mean, I think Richard was doing something similar, though I'm not sure that he was quite as structured as Cage was in using sheets of random numbers, but it became a way of having to not decide. Cage said, there's choice and chance, and I choose chance. And so you don't make the specific decision yourself. Some of the decisions are being made for you, and then you see what happens. It's again trying to find things that you don't expect. And I think you mentioned in your thing about going to the unknown to make the known known, or something like that. And I think that's part of what's going on. I think yeah.
And I remember from conversations with Richard, as some of you may remember, he always emphasized that once he decided on a system, there was no going back. You would see it all the way through to its ultimate conclusion, whatever that may be.
Yeah.
It was predictable as to the end result, but he was really rigorous in that regard. Of course, one prominent feature of the drawings is this use of words or letters as image in these drawings. And, which of course brings up this notion of a conversation. And Howard, you mentioned that too, in relation to the sign language symbols. And we talked a little bit about that in Dick's paintings and how he hoped to engage the viewer. But generally speaking, and sort of looking across a broad range of his work, what kind of conversation do you think he was seeking to have with us, his viewers?
That's a good question.
Yeah. Paul?
Wow. Let's see. Well, actually, right now I'm thinking about how I can retaliate to Howard. So what kind of conversation does he want the viewer to have with his art? Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. I don't think there's any, one answer there. I mean, I think that, I think it would be a fairly complex answer if I attempted, or if the three of us, or four of us attempted, or all of us attempted here. I mean, I think certainly seeing is part of that, and what happens when we see, when we again pay attention, to use this phrase that we're repeating off and on up here. It doesn't remain in the visual realm. When we see, we also are aware of concepts. And as we're aware of concepts, we're aware of texts, words and text and language and everything. And I think that Richard really understood the interplay between seeing and conversation or text and words. And I think that, in a way, is how he sort of brings them all into one play, in a way, if that makes sense. I mean, again, seeing is not just seeing. It's mental, it's linguistic, it's philosophical, so.
Well, it just occurred to me, this is an interesting topic, thinking back on your earlier paintings, where you were very much interested in the structure of sentences.
Oh, uh-huh.
And sort of relating that to language.
Yeah.
So
right,
it seems
for sure.
to be.
Yeah. Well, that concept had to do with the way we see through text. We don't just sort of see with our eyes, we see through context and text, stories we know, stories we've been told, stories we've grown up with, been taught in school. And so I think that's, language and text becomes a very central thing. Yeah. And we see it coming out more and more with him, Richard.
You mentioned conversation, but what strikes me about those is they're so hard to have a conversation with. It's not telling a story, but in fact, just the opposite, and so you see what looks like should be a story, or should be, but it isn't that at all. And that may go back to the idea of helping the viewer discover things by seeing the incompleteness of things, or the illogic of combining things. And when we do live in an illogical world in many ways, and I think that's partly what comes through there. And I think Paul is right that when you see, say, the image of a hand, there are things that happen outside of the painting, it seems to me. So there's a reference outside of the painting. And I was thinking about these as two groups of works. I mean, we call these abstract paintings, but maybe they're more non-objective in a way, that they're not abstracted from something, but they are what they are in themselves. While the works, the drawings and things do make references, they're abstracted from another world, and it isn't a clear logical statement that's being said, and I think that's purposely done by Richard. So there is this sort of befuddlement that gets you engaged there, and it opens the possibility that it could be many things in a way. I think that's another sort of Cagean idea, I would argue.
I think that's emphasized in the paintings on Mylar by that extra dimension and the extra sort of floating quality you get of this insubstantial layer that is not completely opaque, not completely penetrable. Mm-hmm. And it sort of presents things almost in a dreamlike state, very sort of fugitive in some respects.
Howard, you've also, though, spoken about how certain series of paintings are very much embedded in Dick's experience of everyday life, and I'm thinking specifically of the screen paintings, and how they do arise out of, observation.
Direct he does talk about walking down the street and having to look in somebodo's window and seeing the TV and the color, and that sort of gives him an inspiration for doing things. But, I mean, artists make works, and then the rest of us try to make sense out of them, right? And as an art historian or critic, you just fumble around trying to find words. If you're in literature, it's words about words, but here it's words about objects, and it is so difficult. And I do remember having a conversation with Richard and talking about works of art communicate something, absolutely against that idea. So when I use the word, and I always put in quotation marks in honor of Richard. But something does happen when you see the work of art. And what struck me is that it's a kind of, it happens by experiencing the work. Otherwise, if you saw it once, you didn't need to see it again.
Right.
You know? When we go back and look at Cezanne, we go back and look at the paintings, we go back and listen to Beethoven. Even though we've heard these things so many times, because it's in the experiencing that something happens. And that seems to be so important. And otherwise, nothing happens. And so something is, I would say, communicated. Something happens. It's a little bit like, you know, you see your best friend who you haven't seen in 2 years and you give him a hug. Or you have an argument and you give him a hug. Something else happens, right? This experience is different. But something is going back and forth. And that's the kind of thing. And these things, he demands a kind of attention to the object itself. And in the drawings, there's another layer that comes back to what other things that you bring to. What does the hand mean? What is this gesture? All of these kind. What's this part of this word? So it's a different kind of thing.
Really great comments. So I think at this point, we'd love to hear a couple of questions from the audience. Chris?
Mine's not a question. I feel like it's when I look at this work, you cannot underestimate Richard's life as a dancer. That I feel like there is movement in everything, you know, that he did, and whatever the organizational task was, or the process, it's just it's movement that could be just visual, the optical stuff, whether the color choices or it's structural or it's shape, but it is all kinesthetic, and it's you know, if you live with one of his works in your house, it's like it has movement, and so, and that's what I see when I see it. It's like he was a dancer, you know, even in this room.
Really excellent point. Thank you. Mary?
This is more of a comment too, but because the thing I've always found with Richard's work is it's incredibly invitational and relational. That it doesn't, it's not just sitting there for you to see, it's the communication that y'all are talking about. And whenever I had a conversation with Richard, he always made me feel I was really brilliant. And I would say that his paintings and drawings invite you into participation in a spirit of generosity rather than in one of an artist who's done something and then expects you to sort of figure it out.
Participant. He wanted us to be participants, not just people standing in front using our eyes, certainly using our eyes, but going beyond using our eyes. The idea of a participant, I think, is an important thing.
And coming back, Chris, to your comment about dance, the way that he spoke about his paintings and how the viewer responded to them was very much in choreographic terms. Mm-hmm. So that was also a sort of participation that was on a physical level. Dinah?
So I have two things I want to share, but I'd actually like to turn them into a question, so I'll try to make them quick. The first, and this is just full disclosure for anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Paul's wife, so this is not a story about Paul, this is actually a story about Richard. But when Paul reviewed Richard's work for Art Papers for the first time, it was the retrospective at VCU, and the then editor at Art Papers, Paul had a reference to Waiting for Godot in the essay, and then the editor at Art Papers at that time said, "Oh, Paul, I'm so tired of your philosophical yammering, and so could you just take that out?" Paul said, "Sure, I can take that out." So when the review came out, he sent the published review, but then the full draft of the review to Richard, and Richard said to Paul, "I had handwritten passages from Waiting for Godot locked in one of the pieces that nobody could see." And the other thing I want to say is that I learned from him to show another of Renee's films, Night and Fog, which, Scott, you mentioned little bits of residue. That film sort of shows the way time chips away and what we remember. And I learned from him to show that to my students without preparing them for it, asking them to just pay attention. So my observations have to do with attention. I'd really like to go back again to the politics of attention, but also to just the way in which just the utter subtlety of Richard's attentiveness actually demands so much of us. And I'd really just like to hear you talk a little bit more about that, because I think for me it's been profound.
Well, I mean, I guess Richard was a thoughtful person, and that a thoughtful person would make thoughtful art isn't surprising to me, I would say. And I do think, you know, it's like going against the current in many ways. I mean, of course, this has been true of, I think, of contemporary art. Contemporary music is, I'm thinking of classical music, that has never found a stage. I mean, I don't think Webern's pieces are performed, and they were written in the 20s and 30s of the last century, right? But visual art has. But I think that with something like pop art, there's a different way of seeing. You don't spend this kind of attention on pop art because it gives itself to you readily, and you move on. And I think work like this asks something else of the viewer. And again, I think this goes against the current of our society, because not paying attention is so much a part of a commercial aspect of our culture. You know, it's just move on, move on. You know, people would rather have a huge burger that tastes mediocre than a small one that tastes really great. But if you don't pay attention to how it tastes, what difference does it make? I mean, it's that kind of thing. And one of the things I liked about the French, and I remember reading A Year in Provence, that book, and that guy wrote another book called Acquired Taste. And he talked about how the French taught their children to appreciate good food from the time they're little kids. And that is a different kind of way of being in the world. So you sit down at a table, there's a knife and a fork and a napkin. All of that kind of stuff happens. And I think that's not so much a part of our culture. We have houses that don't have dining rooms anymore. I mean, they were gotten rid of in the 50s as a kind of new way of building. And that tells us something about this, I would say. And Richard's things are very different. It's like, take your time, look, something will happen, just give it time. It's almost a Zen aspect to this business of looking very carefully, I would say. And it does go against the current in the society where we're always rushing everywhere, and I'm not sure why. I mean, drive on 95, try and do the speed limit, and you're in real trouble, right? Everybody's in a hurry, and I'm not sure where they're going. My advice is, if you're in a hurry, leave earlier. So, anyway.
I think those subtleties too that you speak of, Dinah, are such an intrinsic part of what, you know, another statement from Richard, you mentioned it earlier, Howard, of making the known unknown so that the known can be known again. Yeah.
And we can see them even when we can't see them. And that's what I think, so, you know, they're available to us in this way.
I think that allows you to form personal relationships with these artworks. And I speak specifically to the paintings. I loved your comment about the kinetics aspect of it all. Because if you look at trapeze, for instance, early choice of pigment, these sort of low-end kind of colors, the Liquitex, and yet the field of green is activated by what's almost an entire tube of alizarin crimson physically worked into the surface of that painting. They're actually fingerprints through the field of color. And when these paintings, the later works, are looked at under magnification, there is that very same, very active, kinetic use of color in floating bodies of medium that are what I think reward you upon continued inspection. The strong graphic arrests you, and then you get what you give to it through that. And it's possessed in that sort of layered motion that's in all of these paintings. A little less obvious here than it is in that painting, but that's sort of, again, the trail of breadcrumbs issue. You look at the technique and you see how it grows and manifests and things. It's actually kind of magical.
Could someone speak to Richard's sense of humor? He was a brilliantly funny person.
We have the front office.
Well, I think humor was an element in his art from the beginning in a lot of different ways. Certainly it was in his life. He really, that was a very important way that I think he got through everything. And the late drawings, I agree. I think he was really ready to just have this wonderful experience of making these drawings, and he loved getting those sly, humorous things into the process. It was important to him.
This is not so much a sense of humor part of Richard, but I want to share something that has always meant so much to me. It's kind of a very small thing, but it's I think, a really wonderful thing about him. And in 1999, I organized a show of his drawings at Mary Baldwin. I was directing the art gallery at Mary Baldwin then, and Richard had just made these beautiful ink drawings that he showed. Did you see the show by any chance?
I did see that show.
Yeah, it was really a wonderful show. And so after the opening for that show, Dinah and I had Richard and Eleanor, I think you were there too, to our house. And we were having a really fun, wonderful dinner. And I can't remember how it came up, but it came up about how much Richard loved Christmas, and especially the Christmas tree. And that just meant so much to me, that he loved that activity of, you know, setting up the Christmas tree, getting out the decorations and lights and everything. And it just seemed like such a beautiful, wonderful thing, and it seemed just perfect for him too. You know, it's like, in a way, I don't know that I would have associated that particular activity with him, but when he was talking about it, it's like, oh yeah, that makes so much sense. I can see him just, you know, loving that activity so much.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
But I think that fits in with this notion of ritual and paying attention. So he talked about how he put all of these ornaments on the tree, and it's that idea that this is something special, like the painting is something special, and you should pay attention to it. So I'm paying attention to the holiday, being with the family, all that stuff. I mean, that fits in, it seems to me, to make perfect sense with the work.
Yeah, for sure.
Like, yeah.
For sure. Yeah. Oh, and I should say, if I can, for that same show, he sent a packet to me before the show opened up. This is before everybody sent everything electronically. So he sent me a CV, his artist statement, a picture or two of himself, and a picture of one of his paintings or drawings. And when that packet arrived, I opened it up, and everything was packaged so beautifully. I mean, it was a work of art. The way he had compiled everything and tied it up, it was so beautiful. And yeah, that says it too, I think.
Well, it was like his studio too, right? Yeah. All these brushes lined up and everything, and all these things lined up.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just like, talk about a neatnik.
Yeah.
And I'm going to say one other thing. Richard did these early paintings in New York. They were in the 50s, 52, 53. I think there was a big flower painting. And what struck me about these was they're really beautiful. And in fact, I think Dory Ashton talked about them in the New York Times. They had this dusty color about them, which reminds me of these works in a way, and the way he did this color. And it was a kind of, you know, almost the same things we see going on here, but they were actually big bouquet of flowers in a vase or something. They're selling them. I remember one hanging back there in the office, and it was just wonderful, I thought, but not unlike the stuff that he would do 20 or 25 years later.
Yeah. It also strikes me as an indication that he, you know, didn't take himself too seriously, and that he would also poke fun a little bit at abstract painting and the difficulties therein, particularly with the strip tease series, which are the 3 horizontal works on paper on the wall between the 2 windows. And there, you know, he's transforming a comic strip into a modernist grid that he then inserts these really funny comments. And those 3 are part of a group of 15. And they're all just really, really wonderful.
And funny.
Yeah, funny. Really funny. One more comment or question? No? Eleanor has thanked everyone who was involved with the catalog production. And I would just like to say a special thanks to Chris Burnside, who with a little arm twisting agreed to contribute to the catalog. And I hope you've read it. If you haven't, it's a personal remembrance in which Chris underscores Richard's generosity, empathy, and enthusiasm, and his ability to offer just the right words of encouragement at exactly the right time. And I know many of us had similar experiences with him, including myself. And so just again to reiterate something that Chris says, in his essay, "May we all make Richard's example our own." So your presence here tonight is really appreciated. Thank you so much for coming.